Hey everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Daniel, and today in this video we'll be covering my round 1 game from the Eastern Action, the 2022 Eastern Action. It was an online tournament, and my rating at the time was 70-73. I was playing black, and let's take a look at what happened in the critical moment of this game. So here it's actually relatively early in the game. In fact, this critical moment doesn't actually bode well for me, because here in fact I play a blunder, which is the move knight to a5. So knight to a5 is actually a blunder because my opponent has the move e5. So now I know that in order to prevent this move e5 here, I should play the move d6 first, and then after, let's say for example, white castles, then we continue with the game, bishop to g4 and etc. However, here I was trying to get this bishop off of this diagonal, or even get my knight to trade it for the bishop. So here I play the move knight to a5 because, as you can see, all the squares on this diagonal are actually in fact covered by a black piece of some sort, and I would be able to trade the bishop off. Or it can go to a4, but then it doesn't really serve much of a purpose. So that was my idea, because I knew that also in this type of a setup, I usually want to trade this bishop off, or maybe even play rook to c8 and knight to c4 at some point. So here, in fact, my opponent plays the move e5, which is the reason why knight to a5 is a mistake. And the reason why is actually because of activity reasons. So in fact, so I noticed that after the move e5 that white would actually get a large lead in activity, as you would see here. So knight takes b3, what I played in the game. E takes f6, I take the rook on a1. F takes g7, and here, since my knight's trapped anyways, I get a pawn for my troubles. Knight takes c2 check, queen takes c2, and after king takes g7, black is up a pawn, since white had to sack the rook, but white actually has a lot of activity in return. As you can see, black's pieces are all on the home rank, on the 8th rank. And in fact, white is ready to castle. All of their pieces are out, and in fact, white's significantly better here. So in the game, my opponent here, he played queen to d2, setting up bishop to h6 ideas with the skewer. Here I drop my king back to g8, bishop to h6 anyways, taking advantage of these dark square weaknesses because I had to trade off my dark square bishop. Rook to e8, simply avoiding the threat on my rook. Knight jumps into d5, taking over more of the center and putting some pressure. And obviously, if I ever move this e-pawn, then maybe there's bishop to g5 at some point with their knight landing on f6, and this rook would be in a lot of hot water. So here I play e6 anyways because I realized that if you play bishop to g5, then I simply have this, and this is actually check. So I wouldn't actually be in any trouble. I would actually be up a piece. So here my opponent played knight back to e3, covering up their king a little bit, also avoiding the threat on their knight. I played d5, taking over the center. Castles, logical, getting their king to safety. I play e5, however, taking more advantage of the center, since my opponent doesn't really have any pawns, doesn't have the e and d pawn anymore, so I use my e and d pawns to take over the center, and they only have pieces to contest it, which means that in any scenario, I would be using only 1 point material pieces to combat their 3 points, or even 5 or 9 points. Knight jumps out to b5, I play d4, taking even more of the center. Knight jumps to c4, and now I understand their idea. They're trying to converge on this d6 square right here. I play a6, allowing their knight to jump in, because I realized I actually have this move rook to e6, which I played in the game. And here, in fact, let's say they play a random move like a3, then I can honestly trade two minor pieces for a rook, which is more advantageous for me. And considering I have this massive center now, with my pieces coming in, I should be completely fine, if not better here. My opponent here, he played the move f4. f4 is actually quite a tricky move. I realized there were actually quite a few things with this. So first things first, my first instinct was to trade here. Knight takes and then queen takes. But then after something like this, I did realize that there was this move rook to e1 after we trade. And then I realized that I have a lot of problems here. In fact, I'm actually completely losing here. If I move my queen anywhere, let's say to b5, for example, to defend e1, then simply after queen takes d4, there's no way of stopping queen to g7 checkmate. combined with the threat of rook to e8. So here, in fact, I noticed I didn't really like this because with this pawn here, it opens up the f file for my opponent. So I didn't really like this too much. Alternatively, I didn't like if I ignored this. White could maybe play f5 at some point, or even takes, and then this structure, for example, let's say I play a random move. This is also in fact really solid. In fact, now this knight is actually on an outpost square defended by this knight, and in fact this sort of forms this infinity loop where this knight defends each other, this knight defends this pawn, and then this pawn defends this knight. So there's actually no way for me to interact or even combat the structure in any way. And also not to mention that b5 is stopped by knight takes b5, so not much I can do there. So in fact, in this position, I come up with the move I play. In fact, here I decide that my best option would actually still just to be rook takes d6. I would have to give away this pawn and allow this activity on the f7 pawn, but I figured that with bishop to e6 I should be okay, considering I probably also have rook to c8 and maybe getting my rook to the open c file. And also I have this past d4 pawn, so that could maybe bode well for me in the future. Rook takes d6, knight takes, queen takes. Here my opponent plays f takes e5. I don't take back. I slide my queen back to d8. My opponent plays bishop to g5, and I realize now that I didn't realize this earlier, but I realize now that this e5 pawn can also support this bishop to f6, which I didn't really notice before, but I realized, okay, well, I have to play the position, so we're gonna see what happens. Here I play queen to f8. I can't really defend this d4 pawn in this position. Say I play a move like queen to d5. I didn't really like bishop to f6 followed by queen to h6. This looked a bit dubious for me. Queen to d7, firstly it blocks in this bishop. Secondly, there's actually this really explosive move e6. If I play queen takes e6, then there's rook e1 with ideas of rook to e8 at some point, bishop to h6. That's sort of a threat. And if I play pawn takes e6, then there's this move queen to f4, getting in on the f file. These squares are all vulnerable, and it's not really boding well for me. If I drop my queen back to e8, for example, then there's simply bishop to h6. Queen to f8 is still a threat because let's say after a4, for example, takes. This is actually checkmate. Not to mention, if I do stop this threat with moves such as bishop to d7, then there's still queen to f6 with threats on g7, and this is actually just checkmate. Here I can't defend the pawn, so here I play queen to d8 and then bishop to g5, so I play queen to f8. So my opponent takes the pawn. I develop my bishop to e6. Simply a4, taking advantage of this because it's at some point a5 can come and it'd be difficult for me to push b5. Play rook to c8, have to get my pieces active. Rook to d1, doubling up on the d file. h5, just giving my king some breathing room here on h7. Bishop to f6, maybe ideas of queen to f4, queen to h6 if my queen does move in the future. Bishop to g4, just attacking the rook, seeing what happens. Rook to d2, avoiding. I come back to e6. Queen to b6, attacking this b7 pawn. I counterattack against the rook on d2. Rook d8 check. Rook takes, queen takes. I drop my queen back to f8. And here, in fact, at this point, I knew my opponent had probably misplayed something because I realized that there's not really much that my opponent can attack. All of these pawns are on light squares, so my bishop can actually defend them. Like let's say we play queen back to b6 and I play bishop to d5 and everything is uber solid. There's really nothing for you to attack. And I can honestly get active with my queen if you move your queen off of this diagonal. Or I can maybe play queen to c5, queen to c8, get in and attack the king, attack these pawns maybe. So I realized that, in fact, I think my opponent had misplayed this and I should be completely fine at this point. So queen to f8. My opponent does play queen to b6. I slide my queen to c8, defending the b7 pawn, also giving my queen the open c file. Maybe queen to c1 check. This pawn's a bit weak. Maybe can put some influence on these pawns with move bishop d5. This pawn's also a bit weak, so there's still chances for me, but I didn't feel like I was going to lose this game. Queen back to d4, centralizing, a good move in general, defending this b2 pawn. Basically everything in white's position is also pretty well defended, so there's not much for me to do. queen to d7. I look for a queen trade. Honestly speaking, at this point I thought it was going to be a draw. Also considering my opponent at the time was 2000 rated, it would still benefit my rating if I ended up actually drawing the game. And considering there's opposite colored bishops, there was a high chance for that. So yeah, I pushed for a draw. Here, however, my opponent actually blundered with the move queen to a7. So queen to a7, the reason why it's actually a blunder is because you kind of just move the queen into a corner here. There's not much for it to do. The only thing it can actually do is attack b7. It does have a threat of maybe getting queen to b8 followed by queen to h8. But I can simply cover that up with queen to c8 and you have to go back. So this actually isn't a good move, but there's actually a different reason why this is a bad move. And the reason why is actually I get queen to d1 check. So queen to d1 check is actually the only winning move. And in fact, during the game, here I didn't actually realize I was winning. And you'll see why. So after king to f2, I play queen to d2. I was, if white went back to g1 or even, so obviously g1, that would lead to queen to e1, king to g1, then queen to e1, so white wouldn't play that. But if king to f1, I was considering just simply repeating, and considering I had really low time, I actually missed the really obvious mate of bishop to c4, king to g1, and queen to e1. I might have spotted that in the game, but considering at the time, I think I had around 10, if not 5 seconds left. I didn't really see it, so that was my idea. I was probably going to repeat. And also here, king to g3, I play queen to d3. Keep in mind, e3 is still guarded by the queen. Here, if my opponent went back to f2, I probably would have played queen to d2 and repeated. I didn't really see how else to win, considering I still had 5 seconds left. However, thankfully here my opponent had played the move king to f4, and I realized I could take advantage of my opponent's really weak king position, because I realized that I managed to cut off the king here, so the king can't retreat back to the third rank. The g4 square is covered by my pawn and my bishop. The e4 square is covered by my queen, and obviously so obviously currently the king can only move to g5. f5 is also covered by all three types of pieces I have. So g5 is the only really square that the king can go to. So here, in fact, I actually play this nice move g5. So g5 is actually g5 actually wins the game right here. The reason why is because so let's look at the variations. So if bishop takes g5, which is what my opponent played, queen to f5 check, and I would actually pick up this bishop. There's no way to actually defend this bishop, and the king has to move. So that would be a winning variation for me. And if king takes g5, I realize then I simply have queen to f5, king, pick your choice, king to h6, and obviously queen to g6 is checkmate. And if king to h4, then I have queen to g4, which is checkmate. So in fact, the best move here for white is to play bishop takes g5, and then here I play queen to f5 check, winning the bishop, king to e3, and then here just a short time scramble. Might not be the most accurate moves, but I'm just trying to make sure I consolidate my position. And here, in fact, in this position, after queen to e3 check, my opponent actually resigned, since mate is pending. For example, just to give a couple of examples, variations, king to b1, then there's simply bishop to b3, locking in the king. The king can't get off the back rank. Queen to e1 is the threat. If king to d1, then simply bishop to b3. This would be checkmate. The king has nowhere to go. All the squares are covered by my pieces, including the one the king is currently on. And yeah, one final variation to note would be king to c2, then after bishop to b3 check, then king to b1, then queen to e1. This is similar to the other position where my opponent would play king to b1 directly, and then I play bishop to b3. And here my opponent would actually be checkmated. They give up their queen, and then I would simply take, and it'd be checkmate. So yeah, in general, a pretty a nice comeback, we'll say, out of that opening blunder that I made with the move knight to a5. I didn't realize there was this move e5. So now that I know that, I would know to play d6 first in that position, and then we would continue to play the game with a normal Sicilian. So yeah, in general, pretty nice comeback win, being pretty resourceful, and also finding this nice move queen to d1 at the end. Although I didn't realize it was winning, thankfully I found the tactical shot at the end with g5, which allowed me to win the bishop and ending up winning the game. So yeah, thanks for watching everyone. Hope you all enjoyed, and yeah, like and subscribe. Thanks.